And she reminded me of a story that I got to share. Even though we're a little behind, I got to share this story. I joined the Army in 2000, and after that, I was a PFC reporting to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Anybody ever been there? Beautiful town. I love Lawton. It's the best time I ever had that I never want to repeat again. But I spent 2 years there. The first year was a typical, it was, I won't embellish it, it was a garrison job, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, most of the part. For the first year. Second year was 2001, and as you all know, things changed. And in October of 2001, I got orders to report to Germany to the 1st Infantry Division. And I figured my life was going to change. And I reported to Wurzburg, which I saw was on your bio. Beautiful city. Lawton will beat it any day, but Wurzburg's not bad. And I knew it was going to change when I met my sergeant major. I wasn't enlisted, obviously. I met my sergeant major, and he was about 6'3", muscular guy, and he was wearing the same uniform because he had just been coming from an event, and the bottom of his rockers were about an inch away from his service stripes. And then the service stripes just went all the way down. And he had read my record, and he knew my date of rank. At that time, I was a specialist E4. And one of the first things he said to me was, "Thank you for reporting. Before you leave, or sometime soon, you're going to be a sergeant, and you're going to be part of the backbone of the Army. But right now, you're at the bottom of that, and you're at the bottom of the backbone. And you know what's at the bottom of the backbone, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know what that is." He goes, "But we're going to fix that, and you will be the backbone of this division," because we were in the Division G2. And I went home and told my wife, I said, "We're no longer in Oklahoma. Things are going to change." And as you all know, life changed for a lot of people in the months following. But everything started at home. And I noticed that when my home suffered, my job suffered. So without the spouses, our military will suffer. So thank the spouses for their support, and I think they deserve another round of applause. When I left Germany, I was stationed here in Hawaii, and I got a job at PACOM, working in the JIOC, and I was an Army guy, and by then I was a staff sergeant, and my job as an Army guy was to provide intelligence support to submarines. And I fought, I was like, I don't know how to do that. I get seasick just thinking about it. And you'll be fine, and I had to learn the silhouettes of surface ships and all this stuff, and I'm like, "You guys see Army, right? I mean, you guys can read that." And they're like, "No, you'll be fine, you'll be fine." And it was honestly one of the best jobs I've ever had. It was shift work. It was standing on the watch floor at the JIOC. But after a while, I'm working with the SAG, the Submarine Analysis Group, I really understood what submarines do for us. And that brings me to my next speaker. And I want to share with you the assimilation of World War II veterans coming back to civilian life did not go well. With so many men flooding the labor market, many could not make ends meet. President Roosevelt did not want this to happen when veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific after World War II. The GI Bill was hotly debated in both congressional houses as the war was still raging on along the European and Pacific fronts. And finally, President Roosevelt signed the GI Bill into law on June 22nd, 1944. Did y'all look at your date, what day today is? It's June 22nd. Today, we are fortunate to have someone here whose life work is to support student veterans as they pursue their educational goals. A veteran of the U.S. Navy, Jared Lyon served as a submariner, did I say that right? A submarine, not a submariner, a submariner, and a diver, taking part in multiple deployments in support of the global war on terrorism. Upon separating from the military in 2005, he became an electronic systems administrator at Northrop Grumman and went on to manage Florida operations for the Washington Nationals Major League Baseball team. And we just found out that we were almost in the same town in Vieira, the National Spring Training, so we probably bumped into each other and didn't even know it. In addition to that, he was working on an Associate's of Arts degree at night from Eastern Florida State College. And then transferring to Florida State University, he served as president of the school's Student Veterans of America chapter and was recognized as the National Student Veteran of the Year by SVA in 2011. He is currently the National President and CEO of Student Veterans of America, and since his appointment to that position in January 2016, Jared has overseen SVA's growth to now include a network of more than 1,500 chapters on campuses in all 50 states and 4 countries, representing more than 750,000 student veterans. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Jared Lyon.
Good morning and aloha. So today is the 75th anniversary of the GI Bill, that landmark piece of legislation that altered the trajectory of America. But the first thing that I need to do is thank all of you for getting me out of Washington, D.C. for a couple of days. So I very much appreciate that. Being here in Hawaii and thinking about the 75th anniversary of the GI Bill has me thinking about the history of when we welcomed home that greatest generation from fighting in Europe and the Pacific. And when they returned home, the GI Bill was a landmark piece of legislation that opened up opportunity for a generation. Today, in 2019, 75 years later, we think of the GI Bill as ubiquitous with education. But it wasn't that way in 1944 when we passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. When we brought home that generation, originally we thought we would have to combat massive unemployment. We were adding 16 million, mostly men, to the workforce who had been ramped up for wartime efforts. And when we brought them home, we weren't really sure how we were going to have them readjust. So whenever you look at a piece of legislation, the easiest way to understand it, in my opinion, is to follow the dollars. And so the biggest amount of dollars that we put into that original GI Bill was something called the 20 and 24. This was unemployment compensation for an entire generation of warfighters. But we also added things like farm subsidies, the ability to start a business, and what we know now as the VA home loan. We built the ability to own your own home. But the notion of adding education was somewhat foreign to America at that time. In 1944, less than 8% of adult-aged Americans had a college degree. If we look at the average level of education for those that served in World War II, it was less than 8th grade. So we didn't think that we should be adding a college education to that piece of legislation. And there were some people who were very against it as well. The then university presidents of the University of Chicago in Illinois and Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts, wrote op-eds in the New York Times lamenting that if we bring this generation home and let them go to college, we will eliminate the opportunity for those who deserve to be there. The university president in Chicago quite literally said, if we let them all back on the GI Bill, we will create hobo jungles, a generation just here for the benefits and not the education. Well, Congress didn't care, and they added the ability to go to college. And we educated almost 50% of the World War II generation, that greatest generation, on the GI Bill. Just 4 short years later, those same 2 university presidents who said, gee golly, y'all, thank you for your service, but if you were smart enough to get into college, how'd you ever wind up in the military? They published op-eds 4 years later that said the only thing that's a problem with these student veterans on our campus is that they're hogging the dean's list. And the president of Harvard University went on to say that the World War II era of student veterans were the most successful students in the history of Harvard University. I've met 5 United States presidents in my life. And last year, I was with George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush, just a few months before both passed away. And when I had the chance to meet with George H.W. Bush, it's something that's unique about that World War II era, and his story is one that tells the story of student veterans. George H.W. Bush, at the time that he earned his wings, was the youngest naval aviator in history. And he was shot down over the Pacific on Barbara 3. His job was that dangerous. His first plane went down in training. His second plane went down, shot down in combat. His third plane was shot down in the Pacific. He lost the other 2 crew members. He was the only survivor. He was rescued by a submarine and thought, wow, I didn't think I'd be rescued and they'll take me right back and I'll get back into the fight. He didn't know he had to stay on patrol with that submarine for the next 40 days, suffering multiple depth charges and completing a successful mission. So when I met with George H.W. Bush, I thanked him for being an honorary submariner. If you think about his story, it's representative of all student veterans. When he came back from the war, he was married, had a young boy who went on to become president himself, George W. Bush, and Jeb was born while he was a student at Yale. He used the GI Bill to major in economics, and if you look at today's student veterans, their top 3 majors are business, science, technology, engineering, and math, and health-related fields. He earned a 4.0 GPA, and the nationwide GPA for student veterans today is at 3.35. Student veterans, the post-9/11 era, have the highest GPA in post-secondary education as a cohort. While he was on campus, he was incredibly involved, and today's student veterans are incredibly involved as leaders on campus. George H.W. Bush was on the cheerleading squad, and he was captain of the Yale baseball team. And he went to the first 2 College World Series, having the chance to actually meet Babe Ruth a couple of weeks before Babe Ruth passed away. He was in the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, and he was very active in his on-campus student veterans organization, just as so many student veterans are today. George H.W. Bush went on, after service in the Navy, to serve in Congress, the UN, the director of the CIA, Vice President of the United States, and President of the United States. When I was with he and Barbara, he presented me and the other 5 veterans I was with his Presidential Challenge coin. And inscribed on that coin is the notion that any life of significance must include service to others. George H.W. Bush would submit that he was no different than anyone else in his generation, the nearly 8 million women and men who returned on the GI Bill to college. And so when we look at today's student veterans, we find a lot in common with that greatest generation. Student Veterans of America is a young organization. We were founded in 2008. But the real story of SVA started in 2006. We had student veterans from my generation, Carlos' generation, Kenny's generation, those of us who served after September 11th, 2001. We were coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan and service around the world. And we were going back to school on the Montgomery GI Bill. Anyone in the room use the Montgomery GI Bill? I separated in 2005. That's how I did most of my education, to earn an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and thanks to now the post-9/11 GI Bill, a master's degree. And I'm the first member in my family to go to college, as are 63% of today's student veterans. The majority of us are first-generation college students. And in 2006, we started looking at the Montgomery GI Bill and comparing it to that legislation of 75 years ago. And when we did, we realized that the original GI Bill paid the university your tuition directly. It provided a living stipend. We'd call that BAH today. It had stipends for books. If you were pursuing degrees that were vital to national security, it gave extra time for you to finish your degree. And if we looked at that greatest generation, and we looked at our generation, that at the time had already been in sustained combat for well over 6 years, no one could have imagined that it would be the longest period of sustained combat in our nation's history, of which it is. They said there maybe could be a better way. And SVA was founded differently than any other veteran organization. Because when we were founded, we had the advent of social media. I don't mean to date myself, but does anyone remember MySpace? Is anyone still friends with Tom? So SVA was founded on MySpace. I'll submit, still the best thing to ever come out of MySpace. And our 3 founding chapters were at the University of Wisconsin, the University of Michigan, and Columbia University of New York. And for the first time, veterans didn't have to gather on posts like previous generations before. We could find each other via social media. And we got together with student veterans from about 23 other campuses in 15 states. And we decided to unite under one banner, and Student Veterans of America was born. We met a couple of US senators, both of them Vietnam veterans themselves. That generation, who perhaps we did not welcome home as well, was damn committed to making sure that ours was a generation that would be welcomed home. So the idea of a new GI Bill was born. And we started to mobilize student veterans in key districts around the United States to help be the grassroots advocacy effort, along with our friends at NVEST, the VFW, the American Legion, DAV, and so many other veteran organizations, to help make a new GI Bill. Those two Vietnam veterans, both of them senators, one officer, Jim Webb, one enlisted, Chuck Hagel, a Marine and a sailor. No yud for my Marines in the room? There you are. And they helped to make a new piece of legislation that became known as the post-9/11 GI Bill. Student Veterans of America has grown from those 23 chapters 11 years ago to now be the country's largest student organization, with 1,528 chapters in all 50 states and U.S. territories and 4 countries overseas. With 754,000 student veterans on a campus with an SVA chapter, we have grown to support our chapter leaders, to conduct landmark research on the efficacy of the GI Bill, and to ensure the voice of the contemporary student veteran harnessing the transformative power of education is represented on Capitol Hill. In 2017, SVA led the charge with so many of the great veteran advocates to pass now the Forever GI Bill, removing the delimitating date of only 15 years to use your education, knowing that when a veteran comes home, their life is complex, and they should be able to use the earned benefit anytime in their life. But we also did 37 other unique things. Did you know that prior to 2007, if you had earned the Purple Heart with less than 36 months of active duty, you were only eligible for half of your GI Bill? We thought that that was wrong, and we didn't care how long you had been in uniform, neither did the enemy. So if you earned a Purple Heart and shed blood for your country, you now have the GI Bill 100% regardless of when you served and for how long. And we went back and retroactive that for the entire post-9/11 era. And so when you look at this new piece of legislation, we passed it 405 to nothing in the House and 100 to nothing in the Senate. A rare show of bipartisanship that I think Congress could continue to learn from. But we expanded the GI Bill by $3.45 billion to ensure that all future generations will have access to education for their entire lives. And when you finally look at it, veterans are among the most educated subset of the US population. Do you know that less than 38% of Americans have a college degree? People don't realize that. If you look at all veterans living, there's nearly 22 million of us. If you look at all veterans living, 66% of us have earned a college education. The post-9/11 era is advancing that. Fully 77% of the post-9/11 era have already earned their degree. The post-9/11 generation of veterans are the most educated subset of the US population. They have higher earned incomes when they graduate and lower unemployment rates. If we look back to 75 years ago, that greatest generation that returned home from fighting in Europe and the Pacific, 49% of them went to college with the GI Bill. Our generation is beating them. And if we think about the era of the greatest generation, we have to recall an interesting footnote in history. We didn't start calling them the greatest generation until 1998, when Tom Brokaw wrote a book by the same title. We waited 53 years to figure out what we would call that generation. I would submit that they earned the moniker the greatest generation, and prior to that we called them the GI generation in honor of the GI Bill. But if we think about ours, the post-9/11 era, and we think about the complex problems that America will face in the future, I would submit that the leaders of tomorrow are on college campuses today, already having worn the cloth of their nation, returning home, earning an education, and going on to lead. Don't be mistaken, this country is facing a leadership deficit. And I believe that it's veterans, specifically those who've gone on and earned their education, who will lead our country in the complex challenges that face us. I would submit that ours is perhaps the opportunity to earn the moniker the next greatest generation. Today's student veterans could not do what they do without your support, and the state of Hawaii has more student veterans than Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming combined. Hawaii has strong support for educated generation of veterans, and her institutions that are community colleges, technical colleges, 4-year programs, and graduate programs are helping a new generation lead in Hawaii and for the country. I couldn't be more honored to be with all of you today. I thank you for your support of the opportunity for an education that our generation is taking advantage of and going on to lead where our country will lead us next. Thank you all so very much. I appreciate it.